This is the brand new NVIDIA RTX 5090. It's the most powerful graphics card in the world. It makes the PS5 Pro look like a toy, as you'd probably expect, since the thing costs $2,000 and it's just one component of a PC. And so I thought the best way to figure out just how powerful this thing is to take the fastest graphics card from 10 years ago and see what kind of gaming experience that thing gives you on this 88-inch 8K TV, and then test that against what something from 5 years ago gives you, what 2 years ago gives you, and then what this is capable of now. So it starts with the GTX 980, pretty much the best consumer-grade graphics card that you could get in early 2015. But then again, this was 2015, you know, the year that GTA 5 came out on PC. So, does it suck today? Well, if we want to get smooth gameplay on Cyberpunk, the absolute highest resolution that we can run it on this graphics card is 1280 by 720. So, 720p. And I kid you not, we are also going to have to crank every single setting to its absolute lowest. Oh, we got a medium here. Oh. Okay, that's soft. I mean, if you really think about it, this is half the resolution of most basic phones that come out now. So when you're blowing that up to an 88-inch display, yeah, it does feel a little bit like Cyberpunk 2015 right now. It's a bit of a shame because technically this graphics card is quite significantly more powerful than a PlayStation 4, but I wouldn't say the experience we're getting right now feels significantly better. It's like fairly smooth. We're getting between 40 and 45 frames per second, but it's not 60, which would be buttery smooth. And while the game world does actually look pretty incredible considering this is absolutely lowest settings, PlayStation 2 water quality aside, it's pretty hard to appreciate it when it's running at 720p. And so just before we jump to the next card, let's run a quick benchmark to put some numbers to that feeling. So this is the 3D Mark Steel Nomad test, and it should give us a pretty good idea of how this card compares to each of the future cards. It's literally running right now at 1.4 frames per second. I've seen PowerPoints that go quicker than this. I think this card just cannot handle textures as high resolution as this. So that's 149 points and an average of 1.5 frames per second. And so now, to see just how badly that gets trounced, then we have the RTX 2080 Ti. This thing was the best consumer-grade graphics card that you could get in early 2020. And the reason that it's now called RTX instead of GTX is because of a little something called ray tracing. So video games have had techniques for lighting since the very early days. It's just that traditionally that lighting would be pre-baked into a scene, meaning that all shadows, all reflections and light interactions were calculated ahead of time and integrated into the actual surfaces. And that can be pretty convincing if it's done well. But ray tracing is the ability of the graphics card to, in real time, recreate the way that each individual light ray actually should behave. The way it creates detailed reflections on shiny surfaces, the way it bounces, the way it scatters. These RTX cards were basically the first time that these lighting calculations could be done fast enough that you can play with them in a video game. So at our previous settings, we are now playing the game at 200 frames per second. Well, that's just excessive, really, isn't it? So settings, let's turn ray tracing on. You've actually got different tiers of it. You've got medium, ultra, and then psycho. This card will only be able to handle medium. And then because even outside of ray tracing, this is just a much more powerful card than last time, I can bump basically everything else to medium too. And then let's also make the resolution 1080p. Wow, okay. Huge difference. First of all, the frame rate is locked at over 60 frames per second. This feels really fluid. This is pretty comparable to the experience of playing on like a PlayStation 5. And the difference in water quality, thanks to the reflections from ray tracing is, I mean, it's generational. Partly because I think this company did a particularly bad job with the non-ray traced water, but still, you can so imagine how this must have felt for people when these RTX cards first came out. Stop it, shoo! I just want to look at ray tracing, go away. Oh yeah, you can see the full reflections in these puddles. It's not just like a blurry approximate mess. And also just generally when you go up close to surfaces, the textures are way higher resolution. And now to try and get some semblance of how 2020 compares to 2015, let's pull up the same Steel Nomad benchmark. Oh wow. Can actually properly appreciate these visuals now. We're looking at around 30 frames per second, which is, you know, the same frame rate we film our videos in, so very watchable. And so that has come out as 3076. That I did not see coming. So that is a 20.6 times improvement. 20.6 times in 5 years. Now that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be 20.6 times better in every game, but for newer games at higher graphic settings, that's a tasty improvement. Especially considering that this benchmark doesn't even factor in the ray tracing part of the equation. But the RTX 1490 is where things start to get extremely juicy, because this guy, released in late 2022, has remained the gold standard in PC graphics, right up until it has just been replaced now. Because if you see the RTX 20 series as the time where we first got started with ray tracing, then the RTX 40 series is when it became child's play. This is the point at which you could do ray tracing with far less of a performance hit. And it's not just ray tracing. I would also say this was the biggest jump so far in terms of intelligent features. For a really long time, the graphics market was pretty simple. Games become more complex, more detailed, more open world, and then new graphics cards come out with more cores and better cores. The more and the better cores that you have, the more simultaneous calculations the graphics card can make, and so the more likely it is that you will be able to brute force crunch these increasingly complicated calculations to actually render these open worlds smoothly in a video game. And while we are still getting more cores each generation, you can tell that the focus is changing. It's becoming less about that raw power improvement because it's hard. We're at a stage now where we're trying to get so many transistors into one of these that each one is approaching atomic scale. So it's becoming more about taking smart shortcuts. Okay, so let's boot up the game. Oh, definitely heard the fans kicking in on that card. Okay, so with the same settings that we were playing on the 2080 Ti at just over 60 frames per second, we're now getting 203. So in a way, it's a similar jump between the 2080 Ti and the GTX 980, but I would say it's even bigger than that this time because one of the key shortcuts that this new RTX 40 series card can now take is called DLSS 3. So this is what it looks like in the settings. And DLSS basically stands for Deep Learning Super Sampling. And you can think of it like the main cores in your graphics card, they're still doing what they always do. They're crunching the numbers and they're trying to get you the max possible frame rate. And there are still more of these cores, and those cores are faster than in previous cards. But then, completely separate to that operation, there is now also a set of AI cores working to make that job even easier for them. DLSS 3 is doing two key things. It's A, upgrading the resolution, meaning that the graphics card's main cores, they might now only have to render each frame at, let's say, 50% of the resolution that you're playing at. And they can now just pass those 50% images to the AI cores, which can bring them up to the 100%. And then also B, generating frames, which when you turn the feature on, will look at the game you're playing. It'll understand the way that characters are moving and the way objects are behaving, and it will then use that understanding to create one AI generated frame in between each standard frame, which, to be really honest, even if I'm being conservative, is an absolutely enormous leap. It should mean that we can now set our resolution way higher than was even possible before. Let's just be dumb and go all the way to 8K. Bear in mind, by the way, 8K is 4 times the resolution of 4K, which makes it 16 times the resolution of 1080p and about 36 times the 720p that we started at. And since we've also just got way more graphics cores to work with, why don't we also set everything else to its highest possible setting and just see what happens? And being able to do this is like a childhood dream come true. This is why anyone builds a gaming PC. High, psycho. Oh, and also the finishing touch is we can upgrade ray tracing to now path tracing, which is basically ray tracing, but to another level. Like instead of selecting a few light sources that it wants to follow for a little bit, this will follow every single light source and it will trace those light rays even further. So let's say that you introduce a new light source into a scene. If you've got path tracing, it's calculating all of the indirect effects, how this light lights up this, which then reflects onto my face, which then reflects onto something else. Okay, so we're about to play Cyberpunk in 8K resolution, everything maxed out, and it works. Holy cow. And that like pristine level of detail even retains in the reflections on the water. You can see the population density's gone up. This actually somewhat feels like a real buzzing city. I actually really like the film grain effect that you get, even though it does add a slight bit of haziness. You see the lens flares? And the material quality has also stepped up a level. I can both see through this glass, but I can also see all of the micro reflections of all the LED signs from the other side. I mean, I know this tech has already been out for a couple of years now, but it's seeing the change in experience compared to what you could get just a few years ago. It's visual overload, isn't it? There's so much happening in one frame. One of the most impressive things is the shadows on the gun. Every single raised area of the gun casts its own individual shadow on the rest of it. That's just wild. This is far, far beyond the expected 30% biannual improvement that you used to get back in the day. And then to be able to have that while the frame rate is practically locked at 60 frames per second, it feels like a trick. And that's because technically it kind of is, but I'm getting there. Can't forget about our benchmark. So RTX 4090 on Steel Nomad, it's way above even 60 frames per second, let alone 30. We are absolutely chilling here, which gives us a score of 8,758. So that is 2.8 times the performance of the 2080 Ti and 57 times the performance of the 980. All leading us to the latest and greatest, the RTX 5090. And the benefit of showing you all the previous cards leading up to it is that now we have the full context to be able to judge just how big, or how small of a leap this next generation actually is. Now, one thing that is quite cool is past versions of NVIDIA-made cards have always had some element of having to take in air from the top and then push that air in a 90 degrees direction across the card. But this is the first time, thanks to a pretty big rearrangement on the inside, that both fans are actually pulling air from here and it's just going straight through to here, which means it will have to pull less hard and therefore it will be quieter. Oh yeah, by the way, I also found the perfect sponsor, the tool I really like for this NVIDIA video. NVIDIA is one of the most powerful use cases of AI that I have ever seen. It can create and edit full-length videos using just text prompts. You type in literally anything and it turns that into a completely ready-to-share video, irrespective of skill level. So for example, I'm going to click here, create animated film. There's so many styles here. Let's go for Lego. And I want my video to be about a tech geek who loves gadgets, gaming and staying indoors to suddenly be attacked by a dragon and get burned. It should teach people the lesson of getting out of the house once in a while.
Hey there. I'm Pixel Pete.
Pixel
My life
Pete.
is perfect. Who needs sunlight when you have LED backlighting, am I right?
That's such a nuanced in-joke that it's making.
But then, something happened that even my 4K 144 Hertz monitor couldn't have prepared me for. I saw a dragon. A real fire-breathing, plastic-melting dragon.
The way that it makes jokes is just so intelligent, and it has an awareness that it is made of plastic and that the dragon is going to melt that plastic.
But then it breathed fire, and suddenly my carefully constructed Lego life came crashing down. As I watched my plastic paradise melt, I realized something important. Maybe, just maybe, there's more to life than respawning and rage quitting.
So good! That's so good! And then this edit box is where you can change things like music or languages or subtitles. It's just blowing my mind right now how much you would have had to spend in terms of the time, the production, the editing to make a video like that. Link in the description to find out more about NVIDIA. So for the 1590, let's start with the benchmark to get a rough gauge of power. Frame rate's about 140 now. That's close to double, but not quite. Okay, 13,803. Now, I wouldn't call that a staggering jump, but it's definitely still a substantial jump. That's 1.6 times the 4090 and then about 90 times the card from a decade ago. And remember, that's really just the raw processing power. That's more cores, that's better cores, that's the faster memory on this graphics card. There's a key factor though that doesn't show up on this test. DLSS 3 has now become DLSS 4. And this is something I'm so curious to test because as crazy as it seemed last generation that AI could create and seamlessly insert one fake frame for every single real frame, effectively doubling your frame rates, DLSS 4, thanks to way smarter AI that better understands what your game is trying to show, can apparently not just make better frames with more texture and improved clarity, but also make 3 fake frames for every real frame, which would give you 4 times the frame rate. Or if you preferred, the same frame rate, but just now with the ability to use all that spare graphics power you've saved and put it towards even more advanced in-game effects or even higher resolution textures. And then, if you also factor in that at the same time as 4xing your frame rate, the upscaling on this card can also 4x your resolution, you end up in this absolutely bizarre, completely unreal sounding situation in which your graphics card is only actually needing to create 1 standard pixel for every 16 pixels that you end up seeing. Okay, so obviously the 5090 graphics card absolutely wallops this game. The same absolutely maxed out settings that we were previously getting about 60 frames per second on, we are now getting just over 90. So that's pretty much exactly in line with the performance improvement predicted by the benchmark. So now let's turn on some extra settings. So we can move from the old school AI model to now the more sophisticated AI model. This is going to make everything look better, but at a slight cost to performance. But then to offset that, now we can not just do 2 times frame generation, but 3 times and 4 times. Just to make this very clear, we are now playing with what's effectively an even higher image quality, and we are pretty much locked at 150 frames per second. All of this trickery doesn't seem to have any visual impact from what I can see. Also, it doesn't make me better at the game, but that's a separate video. In a way, this is like the least noticeable graphics jump so far, but that's more because the game isn't ready for this card. You can't actually dial up the graphics settings any higher than this. So let's just be a little stupid with this. I have downloaded all the mods that I can possibly get working on this. It's gonna make the lighting even crazier, the crowds even busier. That is just wild, isn't it? You know, maybe the most surprising thing about this though is I can't detect an ounce of abnormal input lag. You would think that if you're asking AI to create 3 fake frames after every single one of your real ones, it is going to have to add a tiny bit of extra delay while it's making them. But then there are also other technologies working at the same time to try and counter that. And Well, I guess they work. So with most games on a PC, your CPU is what's going to prepare the frame, and then your GPU is what's going to render that frame to make it the full quality version that you see. And so in 2020, NVIDIA created Reflex, which improves the communication between the CPU and GPU to reduce the latency or input lag by 50%. And this time around, we get Reflex 2, which reduces it by 75%. But to be fair, Reflex 2 isn't even active yet on this game. This is just the base Reflex. So okay, this is all very cool, right? But there's a bit of an asterisk that you have to put across the whole thing. There's a lot of people who don't like the idea of this technology. And I can see why, because the way that a lot of it is being marketed, it does feel disingenuous to me. Like when the RTX 5070 just got announced recently, NVIDIA's whole tagline was basically RTX 4090 performance, which was a $1,599 card for $549. It's only when you dig a little deeper that you realize it's only equivalent to the 4090 when you're in one of these specific situations where every one of their upscaling and frame generation technologies is active and performing at its best. And the issue with generated frames is that they're not always perfect. The same way that, ChatGPT will sometimes get your answers wrong, DLSS gets frames wrong. And if you looked really closely at our gameplay from the RTX 4090, you could absolutely tell. Have a look around the gun as I'm moving around. You see that little bit of ghosting? Those are the types of oddities that will creep in when you really examine things. Would your parents or friends be able to tell? Maybe not. Would you, as the person who is spending hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on a graphics card, be able to tell? I would like to think so. So when NVIDIA is using these technologies to show you how much better the new cards are versus the older ones, it doesn't feel right because they're comparing AI-generated estimations to the real thing. Now that said, I feel like it's important to point out that now that I have the 5090 and we're playing using the technologies on it, I don't actually see many of those oddities now. It still isn't perfect. Like if you look at my weapon as I'm scrolling around quite quickly, the image is a lot more stable looking than it was on the 4090, but you can still notice it a little bit with things like hair and the edges of clothing. The harder the object is for the AI to predict, the more you're going to notice slight weirdness. It's actually ridiculous though. It's easily the best looking gaming experience I've ever had. But then again, at the same time, if you look around my character, it's definitely not quite there. And so ultimately, my point is, NVIDIA's marketing should definitely better differentiate what is raw performance and what is AI performance. It does feel a little like they're trying to build a sort of walled garden in which developers only want to work with NVIDIA and users only want to use NVIDIA. But the actual concept of what's happening here is a complete no-brainer. I mean, you can pay far less for your graphics card, you can game at higher resolutions with better settings while also consuming less energy because your graphics card is working smarter, not harder. I mean, just to give you an idea, the 4090 can consume up to 450 watts of power. The 5070 is a 250 watt card. So even though it isn't always, in the cases where they are equivalent, then you are having the same experience with barely half the energy and a third of the price. There's a bunch of other stuff that's coming soon, like neural materials, which uses AI to interpret what textures should look like. There's mega geometry, which lets developers apparently create 100 times more detail on screen, and even neural faces, which they're saying will push facial features and animations across that uncanny valley line into just straight up photorealistic. I don't know about that one though, it still looks pretty freaky to me. To find out how NVIDIA suddenly became the most valuable tech company on the planet, that video is here. Catch you there.